I remember the day I found his photo. It was 2014 and technically I was at work. I say technically because I wasn't doing my job. I was doing something much more important. I had just started building this family tree with no expectations and no real sense of where it would lead. I wanted to dive into something to keep my mind busy after losing my father and quitting smoking. I didn't grow up with ancestor stories or heirlooms or passed down narratives about where we came from. There was no, we're from here, or our people did this. There was just silence. So when I finally opened the door to records and names and faces, it felt like wandering into an abandoned house and realizing there were still lights on. That day, I hit the jackpot. I found photos, multiple ones. Faces staring back at me from the past, suddenly real, suddenly undeniable. People who had lived entire lives before I existed. People whose blood I carried without knowing their names. One of the faces gave me pause. John Henry Robinson. I didn't know who he was yet. I didn't know where he'd been or what he'd done or how his life had unfolded. I just knew he looked cool. Maybe even regal. He looked composed, confident without trying to prove anything, handsome in a way that didn't feel polished or performative. He looked like someone who had spent his life doing something hard and knowing it. He looked a little tough too. And I remember feeling something that surprised me. Recognition. Not nostalgia, not sentimentality, recognition. The kind where your body reacts before your brain can catch up. I saw resemblance. Not just physically, though that was there too, but something quieter. A familiarity I couldn't explain yet. At the time, it was just fascination, the thrill of discovery, the dopamine hit of finding proof that I came from real people, not just blank space. I saved the photo. I moved on. I kept collecting faces. Back then, I was still what people might call a hobbyist. Curious, enthusiastic, clicking around records without fully understanding how to follow a question to the end. I didn't yet know how to read between the lines or notice when something didn't add up. I was gathering, not tracking. Fast forward to now. It's 2026. I'm older, sharper, more practiced. And I'm sitting in the exact same posture in the exact same way, only now it carries weight. Hoodie, soft pants, coffee within reach, computer open on a cozy Saturday morning, dogs nearby while I reach backward in time. The difference is this. In 2014, I was collecting. In 2026, I know how to hunt. I've learned how to follow records when they stop behaving, how to notice geography that doesn't make sense, how to pause when a life doesn't end where it should. And when I returned to John Henry Robinson with that skill set, the photo changed. Because the face I once found charming belonged to a man who spent most of his life at sea. Not metaphorically, literally. Voyage after voyage. Nova Scotia, Maine, Massachusetts, Rotterdam, Limerick, London, Queenstown, Dunkirk, Liverpool, Cork. Tall ships, long crossings, dangerous work. Endurance that modern life barely prepares us to imagine. This wasn't a weekend sail or a romantic adventure. This was life built on movement, discipline, and risk. And the more I learned, the more that calm authority in that photo made sense. But then something didn't. He died in New York. That stopped me. Because his life didn't point there. His roots didn't center there. His family didn't settle there. Everything about him lived along the edges of the North Atlantic, bouncing between ports that made sense for a working sailor of his time. Nova Scotia, Maine, Massachusetts, New England, that was his world. So why New York? That question was the shift. That was the moment curiosity turned into responsibility. Because once you see a geographic problem like that, you can't unsee it. You either ignore it or you follow it until it breaks open. So I followed it. That's how I found Sailors Snug Harbor. Learning that he died there landed with a strange mix of emotions. Lonely, yes. There's no way around that. A man who crossed oceans, ending his life in an institution, feels quiet in a way that's hard to sit with. But there was something else too. Something grounding. Sailors. A place built for men who had spent their lives doing exactly what he did. Familiarity, not family, but understanding. A man who spent most of his life at sea ended his days with a bunch of other sailors. And still, there was one detail I couldn't get past. He died with absolutely nothing. No property, no possessions, not even clothes. That line lodged itself in my chest and refused to move. Not because it was tragic in a literary sense, but because it felt uncomfortably possible. Because I've seen what happens when people don't get to plan for the ending. Because my own mom is living that reality right now, dependent on others because her body and finances left her no other choice. Because I've worked my entire adult life to avoid that outcome, to build stability where none was given to me as a child. I've always been hyper-independent, gainfully employed, able to treat myself now and then, able to create a life that feels decent, even joyful. And yet looking at his ending, I couldn't shake the fear, the recognition, the understanding that endurance alone doesn't guarantee safety. This wasn't just his story anymore. It was a mirror. And once you see yourself reflected in an ancestor's ending, you don't get to look away. So I went back to the beginning. Not the sea yet, not the institution, the origins. Because if I was going to tell his story honestly, I needed to understand where it started. Before there were ships, there was land. And before there was land in Nova Scotia, there was land in Yorkshire that no longer belonged to the people working it. John Henry Robinson was born in 1840 in Granville, Nova Scotia, but his story doesn't start there. It starts a generation earlier in northern England, where his father, John Robinson, was pushed out of a system that had stopped working for him. The reason is recorded plainly. The farm was over-rented. That phrase matters. Over-rented doesn't mean he failed. It means the system changed around him and there was no way to keep up. Working harder didn't fix it, and staying wasn't an option. So in 1774, he left. We don't have a clean passenger list with his name on it. What we have is pattern. He appears in Nova Scotia that year, in Granville, alongside a cluster of Yorkshire families who all arrived at the same time for the same reasons. Families known to have crossed on ships like the Prince George and the Thomas and William. So while I can't point to the exact vessel, I can say this. He stood on the deck of one of them, and he left because he couldn't afford to stay. He arrived in Nova Scotia with a promise of land. In 1784, that promise became real. 200 acres granted in Granville, ownership instead of rent. But land does not equal ease. Granville wasn't finished. It wasn't comfortable. It was something you had to build into existence. Clearing land, surviving winters, figuring out how to make it work year after year without much margin for failure. He didn't arrive into stability. He arrived into work. And that matters because it sets the tone for everything that comes after. By the time John Henry was a boy, that lesson was already built into the family. When the ground under you stops working, you move. When stability isn't guaranteed, you find another way to earn it. For families like his, the sea wasn't romance. It was strategy. By the time John Henry Robinson appears consistently in maritime records, his life is already shaped by movement. He does not enter the sea experimentally. He enters it as work. His first documented voyage, recorded in his Sailors Snug Harbor application, dates to March of 1871. He joined the Gamecock as mate, 64 tons, loaded with lumber at Calais, Maine, bound for Salem, Massachusetts. A coastal run, practical, necessary. From that point forward, his life becomes legible on paper. What follows is repetition. Schooners, merchant vessels, Nova Scotia to Maine, Maine to Massachusetts, Boston outward, Europe and back, sail, dock, load, cross, unload, repeat. This wasn't an adventure, It was a system. Over time, the records show advancement. Sailor becomes mate. Mate becomes captain. That progression matters. Command at sea wasn't symbolic. It meant responsibility for navigation, crew, cargo, and getting everyone back alive. For years, one vessel appears again and again alongside his name, the Sabra. That kind of consistency isn't accidental. It means he was trusted. According to his own statements, he spent more than 16 years working under the United States flag, with additional service under foreign flags. His life was measured in crossings instead of addresses. And then eventually, there is a moment of stillness. In January of 1899, he stood in Boston and he signed his name. His naturalization record is clear. Born in Granville, Nova Scotia, living in Everett, Massachusetts, a man who had spent decades moving between ports, formalizing something that had already been true in practice. He was the first Robinson in this family line to become a United States citizen. That fact matters to me, not because it marks a beginning, but because it reflects a life already built here. He had already been working, contributing, already moving through the same systems that depended on him. Citizenship didn't create that, it documented it. And at the bottom of that paper is his signature. A man who had crossed oceans, anchoring himself with his own name. He kept working after that, even into his 70s. His final recorded voyage in 1914 lists him as mate aboard the schooner Horatio, sailing from Boston Light to New Brunswick. He stopped when his body stopped cooperating, not before. And by then, the pattern of his life was already set. Movement, work, endurance. John Henry Robinson married Marietta Robbins in 1868. They built a life that looked, at least on paper, like stability. Coastal towns, port-adjacent work, a household that functioned around his absences because it had to. When he was home, he was present. When he wasn't, the rest of it still had to hold. They had children, enough to suggest continuity, enough to suggest that something solid existed. But that kind of structure only works as long as everyone can carry their part of it. By 1900, something had shifted. That census places the family in Everett, Massachusetts, but not in the way you would expect. The household is headed by their son, William, and my second great-grandfather. Marietta is there, listed as his mother. Other children are there too, a full house, multiple generations under one roof. John Henry is not. Not listed as absent, not marked at sea, just not there. That absence is easy to explain on paper. Men who worked the way he did moved constantly. Census records captured households, not motion. If he was between ports or boarding somewhere temporarily, he could disappear from that record entirely. But even while it's explainable, it still matters, because it tells you something about how this family functioned. It was not built around one fixed place. It adapted, and that pattern holds. Marietta died in 1913. After that, there's no longer a central household tied to him. The structure that had absorbed his absences for decades no longer exists in the same way. And then 2 years later, the pressure shows up in writing. In 1915, a foreclosure notice appears in a Maine newspaper. Mortgage, conditions broken, properties at risk. It's formal, legal, and impersonal. The kind of document that doesn't care how long you've worked or what it took to get there. It just records that something couldn't be maintained. Now, I know that land was ultimately not lost. His son, William, and daughter-in-law, Leela, are later living there. So whatever happened next, whether it was resolved, transferred, or absorbed by the family, the story doesn't end in disposition. But that notice still matters because it shows how close he was, how little margin was there at the end, even with land, even with decades of work behind him. It was never fully stable. The children are adults by then, living their own versions of the same life, working, adjusting, making it hold where they can. And this is where the question shows up. If he had children, Why didn't one of them take him in? It sounds simple. It's not. Because when you look at where they actually were, what you see is an absence. You see limitation. His son William, the one who appears the most stable on paper, was not anchored the way that Snapshot suggests. By 1920, he's in Iowa, boarding, listed as unemployed, while his wife and children remain in Maine. That's not a man with room to take someone in. That's a man chasing work or the possibility of it across state lines. And then there's Theodore. He appears in the household consistently into adulthood. In one record, he's working as a grocery stock boy. Steady, local work, but not the kind that builds independence or long-term stability. After that, the record goes quiet. He doesn't establish a household of his own. He doesn't show up the way his siblings do, which suggests that even if he could work, he wasn't in a position to support someone else. So when you lay it out, what you see is not a group of children choosing not to take their father in. You see a group of adults already operating at their limit. Different locations, different pressures, same constraint. By the time John Henry Robinson reached the end of his working life, there was no intact household left for him to return to. What came next was not rejection, it was logistics. And when that limit was reached, the solution didn't come from family, it came from somewhere else. When John Henry Robinson applied to Sailors Snug Harbor in 1915, he was stepping into something that already existed for men like him. Not a mystery, a system. Sailors Snug Harbor was built for a very specific problem. What happens to sailors when they can no longer work? Because maritime labor didn't come with a retirement plan. It came with wear, with risk, with a body that eventually stopped cooperating. So a place was created to catch them at the end. By the time he arrived, it was a functioning community on Staten Island. Dormitories, meals, medical care, structure, not luxury but stability. A final port for men whose lives had been spent in motion. Admission required proof. Proof of sea service, proof of character, and proof that there was no other way. John Henry Robinson met those requirements. His application documents a working life that stretched across decades. First voyage in 1871 aboard the Gamecock. Years of work that followed. Final voyage in 1914 aboard the schooner Horatio. 43 years at sea. And then the record shifts. From movement to stillness. From work to documentation. More than 100 years later, I sent a request into an archive and hoped something would come back, and it did. Taliesin Gamache, an archivist at SUNY Maritime College, found his file and sent me the records. They didn't just send documents. They answered questions. They followed up. They treated this like it mattered, because it does. The file gave me something I didn't have before, a clear view of how his life ended. And that's where I learned something I can't shake. Not from the application, from the record of his death. The language is simple. Personal effects, none. Clothing, none. Property, none. I read that more than once. Because it's one thing to understand that someone died without much. It's another to see it written down like that, on a form, at the end of his life. Taliesin also told me something else. The letters referenced in his application, the ones explaining why his children could not support him, are gone. We know they existed. We know they were required. We just don't have them anymore. And that matters because those letters would have told us how this decision was explained in real time, not guessed at, not reconstructed, explained. Instead, what we have is the outline. We know the question was asked. We know it was answered. We just don't have the words. John Henry Robinson entered Sailors Snug Harbor because there was no other structure left that could absorb him. Not because he was forgotten, not because he was unwanted, but because this is what existed for men like him. He died there in 1922, and the place itself didn't disappear. Today, the grounds of Sailors Snug Harbor still stand, not as a retirement home, but as a cultural center. Museums, art, public space, a place people move through without necessarily knowing what it once was. A place built by labor that now serves something else. I think about that because he died with nothing. No property, no belongings, no physical trace of a life spent working. And yet the system that took him in still exists. The land is still there. The institution changed, but it didn't vanish. Something remained. I go back to the photo, the one I found in 2014, the one that made me stop. John Henry Robinson looking straight ahead, composed, steady, like someone who knew exactly what he was doing. At the time, I thought I was looking at confidence. Now I think I was looking at endurance, because that's what his life was. Not dramatic, not reckless, not romantic, just sustained effort over decades. Work that carried him across oceans. Work that kept him moving. Work that gave him a place in the world, but not a place to land at the end of it. And I can't pretend I don't see myself in that. Not in the details, not in the life you live, but in the structure of it. The independence, the need to support myself, the quiet understanding that stability isn't something you're given, it's something you build and sometimes rebuild over and over again. I've spent my adult life making sure I don't end up in a position where I have nothing, where I have no options, where I have to rely on a system to catch me. And still his story unsettles me because he didn't fail. He worked, he adapted, he did what he was supposed to do. And he still ended his life in a place designed for men who had nowhere else to go. That's the part I can't ignore. But there's something else too. Because he didn't disappear. He didn't vanish without a trace. He didn't get erased. He left a record. A signature on a citizenship paper. A list of voyages. A file in an archive. A photograph that made me stop. And now a story. That's what I have. Not closure. Not a perfect ending. Not a version of his life that resolves cleanly into something comforting. But something real. A man who crossed an ocean because he had to. A man who spent his life crossing it again and again. A man who worked until he couldn't. And a man whose life, for all its movement, still left something behind. Enough for me to find him. Enough for me to tell this. And maybe that's not nothing. This is Loners and Rebels. I'm Heidi, and I'll see you in the next one.